Okay. All right. So we left off here on Friday talking about non-disjunction, right? And so just before that, we separated our two types, we separated chromosomal mutations into two categories. And what are those categories? Frame shift mutations and changes in chromosomal number. Frame shift mutations are things like insertions, deletions, duplications, translocations, inversions, and changes in chromosomal number are almost entirely due to non-disjunction. Non-disjunction. You can have other mechanisms behind it, but it's almost entirely non-disjunction, where either the homologous chromosomes don't separate during anaphase 1, or the sister chromatids don't separate during anaphase 2, or they don't fully separate and you just pull a piece of the chromosome over. Like Joey's illustration of he and I holding hands and somebody pulls and my arm goes along with him. Okay, so this, and then I left off on Friday telling you that most mutations are attributed to the male descent, and we can talk about why that is another time. Actually, I'll just tell you now, males make way more gametes than females do, and so the germ cells have to replicate way more times in males than they do in females, and every time you replicate a cell, you make some mistakes. You know, the error rate is about 1 in a billion, but there are 3 billion nucleotides in the genome. And so, you know, every time you replicate a germ cell to generate more germ cells, you accumulate some mutations. And so since males make way more than females, most of those mutations come from the male line. But non-disjunction, changes in chromosomal number, almost always come from the female. And they're almost always due to non-disjunction, and almost always due to cells at late in life. And this is why the incidence of Down syndrome and other illnesses related to non-disjunction, most of them would result in a fetus that wouldn't fully develop, but almost all of them accelerate as the female ages. Yeah.
Would the probability of a gamete to have an error in its genetic code from the male be the same as the female? Let's say there's 5% of the male sperm has an error in the DNA. Mm-hmm. Even though it's a lot more numerically, it's still only 5% of the sperm.
Oh, it'd be a higher percentage too. It wouldn't just be, it wouldn't be the same percentage. And then since there are more, that's more gametes. It's a higher percentage as well because the gametes are formed from germ cells. And to make male gametes, you have to replicate the germ cell more often. Yeah, so more replications in the germline. So not only would the total number be higher, but the percentage is higher as well. Yeah. Yeah, Sadie.
So for like there are like Down syndrome and like other diseases that like increase with, or the likelihood increases with the stage. But what about something like osteogenesis imperfecta? Like, is that kind of like just something that happens at random, or is there more?
I don't know the specific mutation associated with that illness, so I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry. Now, if it's a point mutation, and then I don't know if it's a mutation that actually causes it, or if it's something that's more likely to happen if you have this mutation, which is most genetic illnesses. They're not directly caused by a mutation. They're just more likely to develop when that certain mutation is present. If that's the case, then it would probably still be mostly male biased because most of the mutations come from the male line. Yeah, anyways, just because of the sheer number of replications in the germline. Yeah. Okay. And so here are non-disjunction events in the autosomal chromosomes 1 through 22. Those are almost always fatal. And those that aren't have severe developmental abnormalities. Okay? But non-disjunction events in the sex chromosomes are better tolerated because our cells are designed to be able to handle different numbers of sex chromosomes. Okay? And so one that isn't is in the case where you have a Y0. So if you have a female that while she's making her gametes has a non-disjunction event that results in no X chromosome being in that gamete, and then the male contributes the Y chromosome, and you have no X chromosome, this is non-viable because there are what you call housekeeping genes on the X chromosome. Genes that are necessary just for the survival of cells. But over here, if you have the mother's gamete give you no X chromosome, but the male gamete gave an X chromosome, you would be mostly normal. It's called Turner syndrome, where you have one X chromosome and no Y. Well, almost every male mammal has one X, and so the cells are designed to be able to function with a single X. And with a little bit of hormone therapy, these people with Turner syndrome are almost entirely normal, except for they are often sterile because their cells oftentimes fail the spindle checkpoint because there's nothing lined up with the other X chromosome. And so they'll fail that spindle checkpoint and they won't continue to move through meiosis. With Klinefelters, so if the female gamete gave you X or two X's, so this is the non-disjunction event. If some of the gametes have none, some of the gametes have two, and then the male gives a Y, this is Klinefelter syndrome, XXY. This is how you could get a male calico cat. If the male cat has Klinefelter syndrome, where he has two X chromosomes and one Y, you still have one Y, and that's what determines the male formation. And again, our cells are built to be able to handle an extra X chromosome. Almost every female mammal has an extra X chromosome that just gets condensed into heterochromatin and doesn't get translated, or the genes on it don't get translated. And so there are some abnormalities, but with very simple hormone therapy, you have very few. In fact, many of the people would have no idea that they have Klinefelter syndrome. But again, a lot of times they're sterile because they failed a spindle checkpoint, because instead of having two chromosomes lined up, you'd have three. And then triple X syndrome is you get two bar bodies instead of a single bar body. Two of the X chromosomes shut down. And so here are the incidence of these, the relative frequency, and then some of the effects. Okay, and these, not all of these are pathologies that you would find in every individual. All right, so that's non-disjunction, results in chromosomal number changes, which are chromosomal mutations. All right, so let's sum this up. How does aneuploidy result in pathology? Either entire chromosomes are lost or they're gained through non-disjunction. If they're lost, obviously you're missing information. Individuals with abnormal chromosomal numbers are called aneuploids. So in humans and in most mammals, alterations in the autosomal chromosomes 1 through 22, would lead to miscarriage. Some of these, like an extra copy of 21, leads to Down syndrome. Probability increases with female age. Alterations of the sex chromosome numbers are usually tolerated. And then our most common examples, Turner syndrome and Klinefelter. And then if you were to change the number of the entire genome, it's fatal in almost all animals. It's fatal in mammals, but it's fatal in almost all animals. But plants tolerate it extremely well. In fact, you can use it to make the fruit on plants bigger, to make the flowers prettier, to make seedless varieties of fruit, because the individual tolerates it, but they fail the spindle checkpoint and don't actually form gametes. And if they don't form gametes, they don't form seeds, and therefore their fruit don't have any seeds. It's fantastic. So you make seedless watermelons, seedless oranges, seedless tangerines, right? And then you can make larger fruit this way as well. Yeah. Or stickier wheat to make, delicious pizza dough.
So is that just like from the physiology of the plant, just it's different enough from from a mammal or other animals that
Yeah.
it's so weird.
Why do they tolerate it so well? I don't know. It's weird. Because animals, you get just a chaotic experience on trying to control gene expression if you have more than two copies of the genome or less than two. But plants, they seem to be able to regulate gene expression just fine. Although they make bigger fruits, so obviously they're expressing more of it. but they're better able to handle it. Could it be maybe because they're living organisms, but they were designed differently, right? So plants are dealt with differently. Biologically, they're living, but they're not described as having the breath of life like animals are. So I don't know. Yeah.
So that kind of changes in the chromosome. Would that qualify as being a GMO?
If we did it purposely, yeah, it'd be a genetically modified crop. Yeah, it's different than like artificial selection. So I don't know if you knew this, but broccoli, cauliflower, kale, mustard, cabbage, all come from the same wild plant, which is wild mustard. And it's just through like artificial selection we've generated these different. So the broccoli and cauliflower, they're the flowers of the plant, and we've just selected for individuals with big, tough flowers, and that's what you get. But they're not genetically modified; they're just artificially selected, right? They're like getting a Chihuahua, but they taste better. And but genetically, if we purposely, a lot of the time we will breed different closely related species of plants to generate the aneuploid individuals. And so it would be considered genetically modified. It's different than, like using a gene gun and shooting genetic material into a seed to generate a change, but it would still be genetically modified. A little bit different though.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next question, I think this might be our last one. What are the inheritance patterns of humans? What are the inheritance patterns of humans? Of human characters. So here we'll talk about, sex-linked inheritance again, and then normal Mendelian inheritance, sum of this whole idea up. All right, so many genetic illnesses follow Mendelian inheritance patterns. Many genetic illnesses follow normal Mendelian inheritance patterns. Many genetic illnesses are due to the recessive allele. And it's because the recessive allele doesn't make the normal protein. So if you don't make the normal protein, your cells lose function and don't function in a particular way. So we call these autosomal recessive traits. This is not the last question. We have one more after this. These are called autosomal recessive traits. Some examples of these: sickle cell disease, cystic fibrosis, PKU, which is phenylketonuria. It's the ability to metabolize phenylalanine. This is something they check babies for. If they're born in a hospital, they just check it when they do the heel prick and check for everything else. And really all it means is you can't drink diet soda. Or if you can, you have to use something that would help you digest the phenylalanine. So only the homozygous recessive individuals are going to get the illness. So only 1 out of every 4 offspring of carriers are going to get the illness. Some genetic mutations, though, are what are called autosomal dominant traits. So they still have normal Mendelian inheritance, but it's the dominant allele that results in the condition. Most of these happen in what you call master control genes. Genes that alter the activity of a number of other genes. That's bonus information, but just so that because with the recessive, it's helpful to know, okay, they're not making the right protein, they lack that function, right? But then you're like, well, what is the dominant? Dominant, they're making that protein, and you're right. The problem is that it's an expression issue, and so it becomes a developmental issue. And so achondroplasia, we've talked about that before, one of the most common forms of dwarfism. Progeria, which is an unusual aging disease where you age incredibly rapidly. Yeah.
If it's dominant, then only people with that.
Right. So if you have 2 recessive, you'll be fine. But if you have 1 dominant allele or 2 dominant alleles, you're going to have the illness.
What I'm saying is the only time it can be carried on is if someone with that illness has kids.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah. You would already know you had the illness, and then sure. Or unless somebody develops that same mutation. Right? So they didn't get it from their parent, but they developed a mutation that got that dominant trait.
Gotcha.
Yep. So even heterozygous individuals have this disease. So 3 out of every 4 offspring in a heterozygous cross, in a monohybrid cross. So yeah, those are a little bit more easy to deal with because you can't be a carrier. You either have the genetic illness or not. You can be a carrier for sickle cell disease. You can be a carrier for cystic fibrosis. You can be a carrier for phenylketonuria and have no impacts physiologically. X-linked recessive traits. These are always going to be more common in males than in females because males only have one X chromosome typically. And so you are heterogametic. You wouldn't refer to it as homozygous because homozygous means you have two copies of the recessive allele. You only have one copy of the recessive allele, but you have the condition. You refer to that as heterogametic. So red-green color blindness, hemophilia, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and these are going to be more common in males. And what's the last of the 4 inheritance patterns? We've talked about autosomal recessive, autosomal dominant, X-linked recessive, X-linked dominant. And so X-linked dominant, a couple of examples: constitutional thrombopathy, an issue, a blood disorder; hereditary enamel hypoplasia, an issue in making enamel. Typically are born with what you call soft teeth, lacking enamel, the dentin exposed. And then the probability here is the same in males and females because all you need is one. You just need one of those copies since it's dominant. So it doesn't matter whether you have 2 chances because all you need is one, right? All you need is one copy of this and you are going to express this. All right, so we're going to take a bit of a lecture break. And what I want you to do is getting with those around you, I want you to explore this question. How can we screen for illnesses in these 4 categories? And should we actually do those screenings? All right, how can we screen if we were for those 4 categories? Should we screen? And maybe a third question you can ask is, what do you do with those data? Right? How would you counsel somebody if you had those data in place? Is 2 minutes enough time? Take 2 minutes, talk about it with those around you, and see what you can come up with. 2 minutes starting now.
It's not that hard to screen for a lot of these. I mean, maybe a little bit. Like, you just take a little bit of the DNA of some of your kid. Like, I mean, because you have DNA in every cell. So, like, you just take, like, a random little piece of it. And then you see if it has, like, a thing.
Yeah, but also parents would have the ability of what their kids are going to have, so you have to screen the parents before they get their kid.
Oh, yeah, that does that too.
Yeah. And you could do that by taking the DNA from the parents or by looking at it.
True that, yeah.
I do that.
I think a lot of people do it because they want to like anything out of it. That's obviously you shouldn't that's not. But at the same time, it's not. It can be helpful to know like you know, like okay, my kid's probably gonna have Down syndrome.
It's definitely like an ethical question. Like, would you have kids if you knew the kid you were gonna have would have serious genetic?
That's why, like, like if people want to find out, because they want to make sure like they don't like script their kids' lives, and yeah, they should have the opportunity to find out, but people shouldn't like be required to.
Exactly, yeah.
It's kind of like where like a lot of the I feel like sci-fi novels going. You know, one day we're gonna have. Or what was the one? You see the movie like when it was coming out about like a test and like only the smart kids survive.
Oh yeah.
Like, that's kind of like the idea is that we're just like controlling like you would agree and just help. I mean, it's basically like just like don't get
Yeah.
That would be the biggest concern.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying, but I'm sure like it's the same concept. So like, as much as it seems simple enough to say like, oh like yeah, it'd be great to know like, and that's what you could like control your kid or not, but it's like, where does that lead?
All right, 10 seconds or so. Wrap up your thoughts.
You don't want people to use it to like breed people.
Yeah, but I mean,
So it's like the optional. The kid probably have this, and you should have one thing for it too.
well,
Like,
like that's from like a perspective from a
Well, and it helps you be more prepared. Like, you can expect
All right.
something to happen. You're like, oh, this is a possibility.
We have some groups that want to share your thoughts with the class. So let me give you a little bit of background. So these types of questions are no longer when will we need to have these questions. These are questions we're dealing with now, and have very few medical professionals trained in the area of bioethics to help people answer these types of questions. And so it's becoming a very interesting dynamic in which you're having to deal with answering big ethical questions and being counseled by people that have no training in how to deal with questions of morality, right? And so this is we live in a very interesting time. Yeah, Sadie.
Am I allowed to say like my answer?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, like screening is currently being used to like you can obviously like you have like the ultrasound.
Right.
And then if everything looks good, then you maybe have like one other follow up and then you're good. Or if something doesn't look right, you can do like blood tests.
Sure.
Or MRIs or something.
Mm-hmm.
Something else to see what is going on if there is something wrong. And the screening is currently being used to see like Down syndrome is an example. If a child the parents are told, hey, your baby's going to be born with Down syndrome. A lot of people use that as a deciding factor as whether or not to take the pregnancy to term. And a lot
Right.
of children who will be born with Down syndrome are aborted.
Sure.
And I know that because a family in our church, they found out that their child was going to be born with Down syndrome, and the doctor assumed that they wanted to terminate the pregnancy.
Right.
They didn't, but that
Yeah.
was the assumption. So, screening is currently being used in a bad way, in a way that we do not agree with. But I think that it could also be used in a constructive way to help better prepare parents if your child is going to be born with Down syndrome or some type of physical or mental disability. You can be well informed. You can do a lot of research about, okay, with the first couple of years, what is this going to look like as
Sure.
the child gets older? What are we going to need to prepare ourselves for? So then you are equipping them to be the best possible caretakers
Sure.
to that child that they can be.
Right. So, and that's why we have to kind of address this as three separate questions, right? How do we screen? Should we screen? And what do we do with those data, right? Three completely different questions that all have, that none of which are ethically neutral, right? Or morally neutral, right? They are all, now every decision, have you all heard the term amoral? Like there are amoral decisions. It's a ridiculous term. Because humans are moral beings, right? We're moral beings, so there's no such thing as an amoral decision if it involves humans, right? There are decisions that are morally neutral, right? That's no matter what you decide, it's not going to be morally right or morally wrong, but that doesn't mean it's an amoral decision. It just means it's a morally neutral decision, right? Because, and then that helps to set it up to where if you know more information, then it oftentimes isn't morally neutral, right? There becomes a morally right and morally wrong. It's just sometimes you don't have enough information to know the difference, and so it's morally neutral until you know more information. Yeah. So how do we use the data? All three of those questions we can deal with. How do we decide what's morally right and what's morally wrong? Yeah. Any other ideas on how do we screen? So you emphasize some areas in how we screen. Ultrasounds are screening technology. Bless you. Yeah.
So people can screen even before they have kids by having just their DNA tested or looking at their pedigrees and family history of
Sure.
seeing how likely they are to have a child with a disease.
Right, and that's very easy to do. I mean, that's way easier to do than it was 10 years ago, and even 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, you can look at a pedigree and get a pretty good idea of whether or not you're a carrier for a recessive genetic illness. But now you could, I mean, if you're really concerned about it, you can have your entire genome sequence for $1,500, and you can know for sure, are you a carrier, right? And so that's a different type of screening. You have some thoughts on should we?
I think people definitely should have that option,
Okay.
especially before they even have kids. Like if they're just thinking about like what are the possibilities and just that, so they can make their choice based on the information. I don't
Sure.
think we should make people do it, but it should be an option.
And then so is it a morally neutral decision when you and your spouse decide whether or not to have kids? Is that decision morally neutral? Right? It's certainly not an amoral decision, because I just told you I don't think there are any such thing as amoral decisions, because we are moral beings. And even animals that have the breath of life but aren't human are still moral beings, right? So if it involves humans or animals, there's no such thing as amoral. And then is that decision morally neutral, right? So when you decide whether or not to have children, is that decision morally neutral? I would say no, it's not a morally neutral decision, and there's a moral right and there's a moral wrong, and the data will help shift what's right and what's wrong, right? Yeah.
I think, because I was thinking about this, it was easier to deal with, like, I think, like, the passages in the Bible that talk about, like, children are a heritage from the Lord, and, like, kind of clear indication, like, the Old Testament is used as, like, his blessing. And then even now, when we look at, like, how, like, there's so much, healing that goes on, like, back in the Old Testament, like, it was obviously God who healed, but now, like, we can kind of see how that works through, like, doctors and stuff. But, like, from our perspective, even though we see, like, the doctors with all this wisdom, we still acknowledge that ultimately that's still God's healing grace, like, that he's given them through their knowledge,
Sure.
like, from a Christian perspective. So I think we can't abandon that when we come to, like, approaching, like, having kids and stuff, as much as we might think that we're getting to such an advanced age where we can start to control what kind of kids we have.
And how many we have.
And how many we have.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
Are you talking about designer babies? What kind of kids we have?
yeah, or something like that. But still, even though we might have more knowledge and feel like we have more control, just as with, like, any general medical situation, we still need to acknowledge that, like, ultimately God's still in control of that, and, like, God's the one who decides whether or not you're going to have kids.
Right.
If you do have kids, that's a blessing from him. It's not something that you genetically set up, So I think, like, there still needs to be a balance. Like,
So you have an ethical framework that's called natural law theory, and it's a way of making rational ethical decisions, and it basically deals with moral goods, and it would say that what provides moral good, something that's morally good, is something that enhances the probability that the individual is going to function the way they were designed to function. Okay. So something that would be morally good then with regards to humans is something that's going to allow them to fully encompass the image of God, right? If we're going to use a biblical idea of what this natural law theory means. So anything that's going to help the human illustrate more of the image of God in them, that's what's morally good, right? And so when we come to this question of do you have children, yes or no, not just period, but every time, right? Every time you make a choice, do you have children or do you not? It's always an ethical decision that is not morally neutral, because we were designed to have children, right? We were designed to procreate, and that's part of the image of God, right? We don't create children like God creates life, but we create children in a and you say, well, animals create children the way we create children, but it's different because animals aren't creating human beings, right? And human beings are distinctly different. We are creating image bearers, right? Ultimately, God's creating image bearers, but through us, And so because that is how we are designed, and this is why the Catholic Church is opposed to birth control. Right? The Catholic Church is really big on natural law theory and natural law ethics. And so they would say anything that prevents or inhibits a human functioning the way they were designed to function is morally wrong. Right? And I would have a hard time disagreeing with them, but I would say sometimes there are other moral duties that are just as important, if not more important, than that moral duty. Right? And so you have sometimes where you have to make decisions that you would consider lose-lose decisions, where your two choices are two choices that are both morally wrong, but you have a responsibility to carry something out, right? And so an example of that, I think you can use one that's far less complicated, is Rahab when the spies were there, right?
yeah.
So she had to make a moral decision: do I lie or do I not? And it had an impact in terms of other moral responsibilities. Do I protect human life or do I not protect it, right? And so she was in a lose-lose. That was a lose-lose decision to make, right? It's just a matter of what is the greater moral responsibility, right? And so the moral responsibility to protect human life outweighs the moral responsibility to tell the truth, And so I would say she made a morally wrong, a decision that was morally wrong for a greater moral responsibility that was morally right. To be able to make a morally right decision. And so I would agree, I think, with the Catholic Church that anything you do in that is technically morally wrong, but you have a greater moral responsibility. And not just to project, like if there's a really high probability of you passing on a genetic illness, that's you now have a moral responsibility with regards to the potential life of your unborn children. On top of that, I think we're at a point in human society where every individual in a developed country is a significant cost globally in terms of global resources, right? It's a little bit different if you live in a country that's in the process of development, but when you live in a developed country, every child is a significant drain on global resources, right? Which has an implication. So I forget the numbers, but it's something every child born in a developed country consumes the amount of resources of 100 individuals in a developing country, right? And so now you have another moral responsibility that you have to deal with, right? If I have children, I am basically preventing 100 people in an undeveloped country from accessing resources because we in a developed country are resource suckers, right? And then so does having children in a developed country, should that be adopting from an undeveloped country rather than having biological children, right? And so you have a question to deal with there. Right? That's what I'm saying. So every decision, there's no such thing as an amoral decision, and very few decisions we make are truly morally neutral, right? It's just sometimes we don't have enough data to fully understand what's morally right and what's morally wrong. But I think the decision to not have kids, I think you'd have a hard time arguing biblically that not having children is morally right, right? Unless there's some other moral responsibility that makes it the morally right decision, right? So, and that's possible. But the decision in an island, I think you'd have a hard time arguing that decision without data of what that might mean for your children and what that might mean globally. If you were able to make that decision in an island, I think you'd have a hard time declaring that that's a morally neutral decision and that it would be the morally right one not to have children. Yeah. Unless you weren't married, of course, right? And then you have a different moral decision entirely. Yeah.
So you're saying just in general having children, like things that are kind of called to have children, or are you talking about the timing of not having children?
Well, certainly we were designed to have children, right? I mean, and even commanded by God to have children. Now you could talk about, I know you and I have had conversations about her and I have had conversations about the stewardship mandate in Genesis 2. And I imagine our conversation about what you would call the cultural mandate in Genesis 1 of multiply and fill the earth. We could have conversations of whether or not that's still in place. But there's no question that that is part of the image of God in us, in that we are creating human beings, right? And you're like, well, I mean, all mammals, procreate that way. Yes, but they're not creating human beings, right? That's very different. And you could say, well, we're not creating human beings either. God is. You're right, but we are as well, right? God didn't even create Jesus apart from Mary, right? So you've got some interesting, I mean, it's undoubtedly we were designed to procreate. And then you're like, well, what about people like married couples that can't have children? The image of God is blurred in every person, right? Now, how that manifests is different from person to person. But, yeah, anyways, sorry. This is getting really deep, I know. It's heavy stuff.
But you think it's okay to like family planning wise, people can kind of.
Yeah, I think you'd have a hard time making an argument that it is morally wrong to screen, unless it's something that's incredibly invasive, right? Like if you're going to do something that's going to increase the likelihood of the baby not coming to term in the screening, now you have an issue, right? I'd say most of your genetic screening, that individual decision is morally neutral. If you decide to have it or you decide not to have it, neither one is morally right. It's a morally neutral decision. What you do with that information now becomes a decision that is not morally neutral. Yeah. Because most of the genetic screenings are not going to impact in any way your ability to procreate or the ability of a baby to come to term, and therefore become morally neutral decisions. But what you do with those, very rarely morally neutral.
So what if you know you're a carrier of something that will affect them their entire life, and you would rather like pick it up? Do you think that is morally not?
So, we're in an interesting situation because I would say, this is interesting. So I have 3 biological children, and I will tell you every single one of them, in my estimation, was a very significant moral decision that I had to weigh a lot of pieces of data. And the third was the most complicated, right? Because the 2 are replacements for us, right? We are 2 nutrient-sucking people in a developed country that are going to die, and that's my wife and I. And our children are 2 nutrient-sucking individuals in a developed country that are also going to die, right? And so that's a way of replacing us. But once you go past 2, now it becomes a very interesting issue in that you are not replacing yourself. You are now producing more nutrient-sucking people in a developed countries than what are going to disappear, right? And so now that became a much more difficult moral decision with our 3rd child. But each one of them, I would say, living in a developed country, it's complicated. It's complicated because there's a lot going on, right? Knowing that your children are going to use 100 times more resources than the average human being on Earth. That's a big weight, in my estimation. Other people would disagree with me.
Of course, it's not your responsibility. Those people in developing countries, the resources they're taking is not your responsibility.
I would disagree with that. I would say the more you know extends your responsibility with what you do with it. And the fact that I understand what living in a developed country means to people living in a developing country gives me a responsibility with regards to how I make those decisions, right? So that would be like you saying, well, if you consume beef, right? If you don't know, how much nutrients it actually takes to bring a single cow to market, right? You're just like, oh, well, it's a morally neutral decision. But when you understand how many nutrients it takes to bring a head of cattle to market and what that means as far as people in other countries and different ways of bringing protein to market, I would argue that it's no longer a morally neutral decision. You actually do have a responsibility to think about. That is a legitimate first world problem, right? If you live in a developing country, I think you're right. You would have little responsibility over what's happening in another place in the world. But living in a developed country, you have a responsibility for what's happening everywhere because you can impact it. You can make a difference. Yep. We could talk about that. That's another conversation for another time. Yeah. How by adopting children from elsewhere and not having your own biologically, by consuming protein that doesn't require as many nutrients, right? Minimizing the amount of nutrients you as an individual use in a developed country.
But it's all like a lot of the nutrients like from America, so it doesn't affect.
Oh no. Maybe with what's the company that runs our Bon Appetit. They use a lot of local resources, but most of what you consume does not come from the United States. A very small percentage of what you consume comes from the United States. Yeah. All right. On that note, so just to begin, so kind of to sum all this up, I think natural law thinking it's a very powerful way of categorizing things as morally right and morally wrong. But I don't think it's the only one we should consider. We're not going to deal with the last question from 13. The last question is cytoplasmic inheritance and genomic imprinting. It just deals with that. Anyway, some things are sex influenced. I think a really robust and well-developed ethical model should use 3 things. Should use natural law thinking, right? So how does this decision impact the image of God in this individual? I think it's a very powerful question to ask that should shape the way we make moral decisions. Another one comes from divine command theory. Has God revealed his desire in this area, right? Through what he commands or even just what he encourages, right? Has God revealed his desires? How do God's revealed desires impact this decision? Oftentimes the decisions we make that we don't know, right? It's like, what does God want us to do with regards to genetic screening? I don't know. And I think if you tried to make an attempt from that, other than on having to do with how we were designed, which is more natural law thinking, I think it'd be out of context and probably not very well done. And the third one is called virtue ethics, and that's where you have particular virtues. So Aristotle was a big virtue ethics guy, and he had 4 virtues. It was fortitude, wisdom, temperance, and justice were Aristotle's 4 virtues. And then Aquinas adopted that kind of thinking and added faith, hope, and love as 3 Christian virtues and kept Aristotle's 4. And so then another way of thinking is, are there certain virtues that influence or indicate how you ought to operate in this area? Like the fact of what does it mean to show love to somebody, right? Or what does it mean to have faith that your eternity is secure? What does it mean to hope that, this is temporary, whatever this condition is? And then you've got fortitude, temperance, justice, and wisdom as well. And so those, I think, can influence those. Those are a little bit, I think, virtue ethics requires the most research on your part. Divine command theory and natural law are a little bit simpler to deal with, that you can operate. Those questions are a little bit easier to answer. The virtue questions are a little bit more complicated to answer and require some real thought and research into what it looks like to exemplify those virtues. But then you could always just use an exemplar, like a moral exemplar. So that whole thing that was big in the 80s of like, what would Jesus do? That's virtue ethics right there. It's like, what would Jesus do? But oftentimes we don't know, right? So it's like, what would somebody that looks more like Jesus than I do? Right? Right? The Apostle Paul did things that Jesus didn't do, so we could model our lives after the Apostle Paul. Or you can model your life after somebody in your church that's more sanctified than you are. And what would they do? And I think that's okay under virtue ethics. All right? Well, wow, we took a lot more of the class time than I had anticipated we would, and even left off a question. If you don't want to hang around for the last 5 minutes of our scheduled class time, you are free to go. It is in no way going to offend me if you decide that you are going to go instead of stay.